Amongst all the genres of anime, horror seems to be one of the smallest, and horror anime that are actually frightening in some capacity are a rare commodity. Realistically, all we have are Higurashi, Shiki, Shinsekai Yori to a certain extent, and maybe High School of the Dead if you look at it the right way. Well, definitely not that way. There is the action horror genre as well, but shows like Hellsing and Dead Man Wonderland don't really scratch the same itch as true horror stories do. There is one other horror anime that does provide the same sense of thrill and fright that I often look for in a good horror series, and that anime is Yamishibai. Yamishibai is a Japanese anthology series, with each episode telling its own unique story. Each episode basically plays out like a typical ghost story you would tell around a campfire, starting with a normal situation and ending with something horrific. However, the Yamishibai franchise isn't exactly consistent, and I want to take a look at why the good seasons work versus why the bad seasons fail. Let's start at the beginning with Season 1. When you start to break down the different elements of what makes the first season scary, it turns out that the mechanics it employs are pretty basic and repetitive. An episode typically starts with an everyday situation, something that the average viewer can understand right away. Moving into a new apartment, staying late at work, a hospital stay, anything normal will do. And the more normal, the better. This concept is deeply rooted in the traditional ghost storytelling method that uses vague and non-specific terms for settings and characters. Using terms like a certain man subconsciously puts the idea in our heads that this could happen to anyone, including us, just as easily as it happens to the person in the story. Another important factor in the setup for the story is establishing that the character that the horror is happening to has done something worthy of them being haunted. This isn't really necessary, but it subtly creates a reason for the haunting to occur. Watching bad stuff happen for no reason, while possibly feeling a bit more realistic, doesn't work well in establishing the proper mood for a ghost story. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the character doing something bad or mean either. It could just be a tiny mistake or not having the right attitude about something. Disobeying your parents, ripping up a talisman, getting overly annoyed by other people, or just being curious are more than enough to prime us for having the horrifying situation that's about to unfold happen to that particular person. And much like before, the more general and easy to understand the mistake, the better. I'm sure most of us have had a really bad day where we find every single thing extremely annoying, or we end up being a little too curious about something, and so it allows us to experience the story more personally. Next comes the introduction of the supernatural, something that breaks away from what we consider normal and takes us into the realm of fantasy and horror. The less obtrusive its introduction, the better, so as not to completely throw the audience off and allow us to slip into the meat of the story without much notice. Obviously, we do notice because we know that we're watching a horror story, but its subtle nature still makes us more receptive to the change. From there, we begin a slow escalation of the supernatural elements, usually just by adding more of the thing that was first introduced. Occasionally, they'll also throw in a mild jump scare somewhere in the middle to keep you on your toes and make sure you know that the threat is real. While all of this is happening, the music and sound effects will typically grow louder and eerier, and sometimes the color design will start to become distorted to exaggerate the disturbing situation that the character has been put in. Then, just before the final scare, there's usually some kind of diffusion of tension. The music dims or cuts out entirely, and the character believes that they've gotten off scot-free. And then... one final moment to close out the scene with the character being completely defeated by the evil that they've encountered. Again, there will always be some mild variations on how exactly each story plays out, but the general steps I've outlined here are usually the best way to go about things. Most of the stories in Season 1 follow this pattern, and so most of them are pretty fun to watch. Once we get out of Season 1, however, we start to see noticeable differences in how each story is constructed, and usually not for the better. Very small differences for sure, but big enough to where our subconscious reaction to the fear presented in the story is significantly altered. Season 2's most noticeable difference from Season 1 is its shift away from the jump scare hook, with most of its stories being in favor of a more existential take on fear. With one of the directors for this season being Takashi Shimizu, the man behind Ju-On, the original Japanese version of The Grudge, combined with the shift towards a deeper take on horror, you would think that we'd see some of the best stories stories that this franchise has ever given us. Unfortunately, a lot of the ideas for this season don't exactly translate well in regards to actually being scary or terrifying. There's a much larger focus on the story's characters coming into contact with some kind of creepy phenomenon and then trying to deal with that phenomenon in that moment, often with characters succumbing to madness rather than being attacked by a malevolent spirit. These ideas are fine in theory, and some of them do have interesting themes in regards to the nature of the human psyche, such as with episode 7, Capsule Toy Machine. But Yamishibai isn't exactly a great place for these ideas to be presented. As should go without saying based on the footage shown in this video, Yamishibai is a very low budget affair. There's still more than enough capability for it to set the mood for a scary payoff, but there's not exactly a lot of room for artistic freedom either in regards to how the story is presented. The ideas conveyed in season 2 would be much more at home in something equivalent to Death Parade or something like that, as Yamishibai just doesn't have the ability to present these ideas with enough style to make them feel memorable, on top of the fact that these stories are still only 4 minutes long. The reason the short length worked so well in the first season is, despite how good it is, it's ultimately a very shallow experience. You go in, feel nervous for a couple minutes, get your jump scare, and then move on to the next one. And that briefness is one of episode 1's biggest strengths. But when you don't have that big payoff at the end of the episode, you're ultimately left with nothing. Not even the lingering tension of a jump scare. Even in the episodes that do try to be more like season 1, there's still a lot that's not quite right about their presentation. Season 2 ditches the idea that the characters need to have done something in order to warrant the haunting, taking away that subconscious notion that the haunting is deserved. Again, it's not totally necessary to have this element, but taking it away entirely after most of the episodes in season 1 relied on it does create a thematic dissonance in our interpretation of the stories. It even fails when it tries to do proper jump scares. Take a look at this moment from the end of episode 8, Farewell Confessional.
脅かしやがって。それ、本当か。
While this could have been an effective jump scare, it ultimately loses its effect because we sit on the money shot for way too long. The longer we see the monster, the less impact it leaves because, once again, this isn't exactly a high production value show. Compare that to the end of episode 4 in season 1. Here, the jump scare is long enough for us to fully register what we're being scared by, but short enough to not overstay its welcome and become less scary. A good jump scare is brief but impacting, and dwelling on the monster for too long lessens its scariness. While I can at least appreciate what Season 2 was trying to do thematically, it ultimately failed to do so because it just wasn't equipped with the right style to execute its stories properly. They weren't terrible, but still not strong enough to make them worthwhile because of all the mistakes they make. And then Season 3 takes all of those mistakes, amplifies them, and tosses out any semblance of thematic depth whatsoever. I suppose this is what happens when you take someone who's only ever worked on music production and then toss them into the director's chair, but Season 3 is easily the lowest point for the Yamishibai franchise, and was personally my least favorite anime that I finished from all of 2016. It takes the subtlety of Season 1 and the unnerving themes of Season 2, and throws them out the window in favor of shoving as many creepy images in your face as possible. There are moments where we spend an entire episode with a monster on screen and in plain sight, completely taking away any of the mystery surrounding it and any possibility of it actually scaring us. Yes, the imagery is grotesque, but it's hardly frightening in any capacity. On top of that, the sound effects and OST are intensely overplayed and do nothing to create an eerie or tense atmosphere, with one particular sound effect of a cackling woman being extremely annoying every time I hear it. However, I do have to at least give credit to episode 9, The Fourth Man, which was the only episode in season 3 that I thought had any merit whatsoever. It follows the template of season 1's episodes pretty closely and actually has a few misdirects early on before the actual horror elements start to kick in, leading to a pretty solid gotcha moment at the end, though it still ended up losing a bit of its edge because it dwelled on the final shot for too long, like I mentioned about season 2. Unfortunately, this is just a one-off instance, and no other episode in Season 3 even comes close in quality. Strangely enough, every single problem with Season 3 can be clearly seen in the animation for the ED, where a bunch of Yamishibai masks are blasting the ED's lyrics into a child's ears. Rather than use tight directing or thematic intrigue, Season 3 just crams all of its creepiness down your throat without giving you any time to digest the horror it's trying to convey. At this point, it might be safe to assume that there's nothing to be gained from watching any more of this franchise. And yet, despite receiving the worst fan reception so far, I actually thought Season 4 was pretty alright because it returned to the typical ghost story structure of Season 1. The biggest complaint about Season 4 seems to be the excessive amount of narration used throughout each episode. And while I can understand why some people might not like that, I thought it actually added a lot more to the story than you might realize. Yamishibai is firmly couched in the idea that these are simple ghost stories. After all, the entire presentation of the story is based on a style of Japanese storytelling known as Kamishibai, where a single narrator uses a series of pictures to tell a story. To be honest, I'm actually a bit surprised that the series didn't use over-narration from the very beginning, because it fits right in with the kind of presentation it's giving. What's more, the narration can actually help in directing the viewer's attention where it wants to in order to set up a surprise twist. And the first episode of this season, Tongue, is a great example. The episode focuses on a man who buries a dead cat he found in the road, and is then haunted by the cat's spirit later that night because it followed him home. As the episode ramps up towards its conclusion, the cat starts licking the man's face, though he's still too afraid to turn around and look at the cat. Meanwhile, the narrator is constantly describing the cat and the sensation of the cat's tongue as it licks the man, as well as the constantly rising fear that the man is experiencing. Eventually, the man finally turns around to see the cat that's been licking his face, only to realize that it wasn't just the cat that followed him home, but also the ghost of a woman, who it turns out was actually the one licking him. In this instance, the narrator's constant focus on describing the cat distracted us from the real menace, leading to a much better payoff when the true threat is finally revealed. The over-narration isn't used like this all the time, but it's still one of the perks to having it. In general, the narration makes the series feel much more like I'm listening to someone tell a scary story, and the strength of the narrator's deliveries often help greatly in adding to the eeriness of a scene. Unfortunately, Season 4 still isn't as meaty as the first season. It definitely tries to be scary, and it occasionally succeeds, especially in the first few episodes, but as the season drags on, it feels like the ideas gradually just run out of steam. It's not even that it fails to follow the rules that Season 1 had set up, it just kind of runs out of ideas on how to end each episode with a good scare, with a perfect example of this being Episode 8, Cassette Tape, where nothing actually happens to the character in the story aside from a creepy dictation from a cassette player. And so we come to Season 5, the latest installment in the series thus far. Season 5 is unique from a production standpoint in that all of the writers for this season were women, and it's a bit obvious when you see the kind of stories that are presented in this season. In regards to its overall presentation, Season 5 actually feels like the weirdest one of the bunch because there are so many moments where it feels like it's trying to teach some sort of moral or lesson. Don't spoil children, don't leave your kids alone, don't be vain. Almost every episode has something like this that it's trying to convey, and how heavy-handed these morals are varies with each episode. It's an interesting concept to say the least, but it mostly just ends up interfering with the progression of each episode, dragging out the endings in order to get its message across. As for the actual scariness of each episode, it's probably the most hit-and-miss season yet. Episodes 2, 7, and 8 are really the only ones worthy of note, and unsurprisingly, they follow the patterns of Season 1 pretty closely. Aside from those episodes, most of the season isn't worth watching, mostly because it often shows the horror in plain sight for far too long, with the boring and lifeless chase sequence in Episode 9, If You Want to See Ghosts, exhibiting this perfectly. What really put the final nail in the coffin for me in concluding that Season 5 ultimately isn't worth it is that its final episode is similar to the end of Season 3. Both Seasons 3 and 5 use their final episodes to try and tie everything together and make some kind of meta commentary about the series overall, and both instances fail miserably. Season 3's finale fails just like the rest of Season 3 does, only now it feels even more pretentious than before, and Season 5's finale just comes out of nowhere and doesn't really make any sense or tie into the story that much at all. In the end, Yamishibai as a whole is less an exhibition definition of great horror storytelling, and more a fascinating study of how the basics of horror function, as well as how diverting from said basics without understanding them can lead to a less fulfilling presentation. If this video made you interested in checking out the entire series, but you don't want to sift through all the bad episodes to find the good ones, I'll be posting an episode guide I made in the description below of all the stories that I personally found either sufficiently scary or at least interesting enough to spend your time on this Halloween season. Thanks for watching, everyone. This video ended up being twice as long as I had originally planned since there was so much stuff I had to talk about with this series, and you can probably tell that my voice was not prepared to do this all in one take. I should also hopefully be finished with the rest of the summer season by the time this comes out, so you can head on over to Digital Fox Media to see my favorite anime of the season, as well as some other anime-related content. And if you enjoyed this video and want to see more, be sure to like, subscribe, and ring that little notification bell so you can stay up to date on all my latest content. Share this video around with people you think will be interested, leave a comment below about what you thought and other topics you'd like me to cover in the future, and don't forget to follow me on Facebook and Twitter. My name is Ember, and I hope you have a happy Halloween.